Somewhere in the middle of Salisbury Plain, there's a single stone weighing roughly 6 tons, about the weight of a fully loaded school bus, and for the last several years, that one stone has quietly demolished almost everything we thought we understood about the people who built Stonehenge. Not because of who carved it, not because of some hidden code etched into its surface, because of where it came from. In 2024, scientists proved that this stone did not come from anywhere near Stonehenge. It did not come from Wales, where the other famous blue stones originated. It came from the far north of Scotland, from a region more than 700 kilometers away, across rivers, mountains, forests, and open water, carried by people who had no wheel, no horse, no ox, strong enough to pull a sled that heavy, and apparently no reason to give up. And the deeper scientists have dug into how that happened. The stranger and more impressive the real story has become. Stranger, honestly, than any AI-generated headline could invent, because this one is actually true. Picture the scale of that for a second, stripped of all the academic language. Imagine being a farmer 5,000 years ago, living at the very top of Britain, in a landscape of cold lochs and windswept hills, and somehow agreeing to help quarry a stone the size of a small car out of solid rock using nothing but harder rocks, bone tools, and stubbornness. Then imagine helping drag that stone, inch by exhausting inch, across terrain with no roads, no pack animals strong enough for the job, no machinery of any kind, for a distance equivalent to walking from London to the Scottish border and back again, more than once. Now imagine doing it not for food, not for safety, not for any reward you would ever personally collect, but for a religious or ceremonial purpose you believed in enough to spend years, maybe decades, of communal effort making it happen. That is not folklore. That is not speculation dressed up for a thumbnail. That is, as of the last 2 years, the leading scientifically supported explanation for how the most important stone at the heart of Stonehenge actually got there. And almost nobody outside a small circle of geologists knew about it until very recently. For most of the last century, there has been a quiet, stubborn argument running through British archaeology, one that never made the news the way a tomb full of gold or a face reconstructed from an ancient skull would. The argument was about geology, of all things, specifically about how Stonehenge's smaller stones, the ones known as blue stones, ended up on a plain in southern England when the nearest matching rock formations sit all the way over in the hills of West Wales, roughly 250 kilometers away. One camp insisted this had to be the work of human hands, that Neolithic communities, somewhere around 5,000 years ago, deliberately selected these specific stones, broke them free from their native outcrops, and physically dragged, rolled, rafted, or somehow hauled them across an enormous and brutally difficult stretch of ancient Britain to build a monument on a plain that had no stone of its own. The other camp found that idea almost too difficult to believe and proposed something that sounds, on its surface, far less dramatic. That the stones never needed human transport at all because they had already been carried most of the way by glaciers during the last ice age, scraped up from Wales, and deposited naturally across southern England long before any human being ever set foot on Salisbury Plain. Under that theory, the builders of Stonehenge weren't moving mountains. They were simply picking up rocks that nature had already conveniently left lying around nearby. This wasn't a small academic squabble. It cuts directly into one of the biggest questions you can ask about prehistoric people. How organized were they, really? How far could a Stone Age community plan, coordinate, and sustain an effort when the effort in question might take years, might require hundreds of people working in careful coordination, and offered no immediate practical reward, no food, no shelter, no defense against an enemy? If the glaciers did the heavy lifting, then Stonehenge becomes a story about people cleverly using what was conveniently available to them. If human beings did it themselves on purpose across hundreds of kilometers of unforgiving terrain, then Stonehenge becomes something else entirely. A story about a society capable of long-term collective ambition on a scale most of us, looking at scattered hunter-gatherer, adjacent communities from 5,000 years ago, would never have guessed was possible. For years, this argument played out almost entirely through dueling geochemical papers, the kind of slow-motion academic disagreement most people never hear about unless they happen to read specialist journals. One side would publish results pointing toward a particular Welsh source region for the bluestones, citing detailed multi-sample statistical analysis. Researchers favoring some version of natural transport would respond by questioning the sampling methods, pointing out that weathering and surface contamination can subtly distort geochemical readings if you're not careful, and raising the possibility of more complex, partly natural pathways. Back and forth it went, paper after paper, conference after conference, neither side landing a knockout blow, largely because everyone was still relying on indirect chemical comparisons that left room for honest disagreement. What changed in 2024 and 2025 wasn't a cleverer argument, it was a sharper tool. One precise enough to stop the debate from being a matter of interpretation at all, The first real crack in the glacier theory came in 2024, when a team led by researchers at Curtin University in Australia focused their attention on the single most important stone at the entire monument, the altar stone, a massive sandstone block lying flat at the heart of the inner horseshoe beneath the most famous trilithon arrangement at Stonehenge's center. For decades, the altar stone had simply been lumped in with the other blue stones and assumed to share their general origin somewhere in Wales. Nobody had bothered to test that assumption properly because nobody had a strong enough reason to question it. The Curtin team did test it, and the results didn't just adjust the existing theory, they obliterated it. The mineral composition of the altar stone, down to the chemical signature of microscopic zircon and apatite crystals locked inside it, didn't match anything in Wales at all. It matched rock formations in the far north of Scotland, in a region known as the Orcadian Basin, a geological signature so specific and so distinctive that there was effectively no honest way to argue it was a coincidence. To understand why this result mattered so much, you have to understand what these scientists were actually looking at. Every rock on Earth carries a kind of chemical birth certificate buried inside it, formed by the exact mineral conditions present when that rock originally crystallized, hundreds of millions of years before any human walked the planet. Tiny crystals of zircon and apatite, some no larger than a grain of sand, lock and trace elements and radioactive decay patterns unique to the specific geological environment where they formed. Geologists can extract these microscopic crystals, measure their chemical fingerprint with extraordinary precision, and compare that fingerprint against a map of known rock formations across an entire country, narrowing down a stone's true point of origin the way a detective might trace a bullet back to a single specific gun. It's worth pausing on just how unforgiving this kind of test is to any kind of doubt or wishful thinking. You cannot fake a zircon signature. You cannot misread it the way a human eye might misjudge two slightly different shades of gray sandstone sitting side by side in a museum case. The crystal either matches a known geological formation or it doesn't, and the chance of two unrelated rock sources on opposite ends of an island producing an identical, coincidental fingerprint by sheer accident is vanishingly small. This is precisely why the result landed as hard as it did within the field. Geologists weren't offering an opinion or a best guess based on how the stone looked. They were presenting something closer to an irrefutable paternity test for rock, and the test came back pointing unmistakably toward the opposite end of the country from where anyone had assumed. When the Curtin team ran the altar stone's fingerprint against that map, it pointed again and again, unmistakably north, not to the nearby hills of Wales, but past them entirely, past most of England, into a part of Scotland separated from Stonehenge by some of the most physically demanding terrain in all of Britain, and abrasion patterns that are essentially a glacier's signature, baked permanently into the stone's surface the way a scraped knee tells you exactly how a fall happened. The Newall boulder had none of it, no striations, no glacial polish, nothing consistent with having been picked up and carried by an ice sheet at all. What its surface did show was consistent with intentional human quarrying and transport, meaning this particular fragment, like the altar stone before it, had almost certainly been deliberately broken away from its source in Wales and carried by people the more than 200 kilometers to Salisbury Plain. Then came the part of the research that finally, conclusively, put real numbers behind the human transport theory, rather than just ruling out the alternative by process of elimination. Scientists turned their attention to the rivers surrounding Stonehenge itself, analyzing the same kind of microscopic zircon and apatite signatures, but this time hunting for them in modern river sediment near the monument. Sediment that, if glaciers had truly scattered stones from Wales across this region thousands of years ago, should still contain traces of that glacial deposit today, eroded out of the surrounding landscape over millennia, exactly the way a forensic team finds gunpowder residue lingering in soil decades after a crime. The team analyzed those sediment samples expecting, at a minimum, a partial match to Welsh bluestone material somewhere in the local geology. They found essentially none. No meaningful trace of bluestone matching mineral signatures scattered naturally through the regional sediment. No leftover evidence of an ancient glacial dumping ground anywhere nearby. If the ice sheets had genuinely deposited these stones near Stonehenge on their own, the surrounding landscape should be quietly littered with the chemical fingerprints of that event. It isn't. The stones at Stonehenge are, geologically speaking, strangers to the ground they're standing on, foreign material in a landscape that never produced anything like them naturally, which leaves exactly one remaining explanation for how they got there at all. Now picture what that actually required, because this is the part where the achievement stops being an abstract geology debate and starts becoming something almost unbelievable to imagine in practice. A community working with only stone, wood, fiber rope, and raw human muscle had to break a multi-ton block free from solid rock, using nothing but other rocks in patient, repetitive effort. They then had to move that block by some combination of wooden sledges, log rollers, earthen trackways, and very likely rafts or boats across whatever rivers and coastal waters stood in their path, across more than 200 kilometers of Welsh and English terrain for the bluestones, and over 700 kilometers for the altar stone alone, through forests, across hills, possibly along river systems, an exposed coastline where a single capsized raft could have meant losing the entire stone, and with it, potentially years of accumulated effort, to the bottom of a river or the open sea. Consider just the coastline problem alone. A plausible route for the altar stone's 700-kilometer journey would have required navigating stretches of open water along Britain's eastern or western coast, meaning that at some point a 6-ton stone had to be loaded onto some kind of raft or vessel sturdy enough to keep it afloat, balanced precisely enough that it wouldn't simply roll and capsize the craft the moment the sea turned choppy and steered by people with no compass, no map, and no prior experience anyone could have written down for them, because nobody had ever attempted anything like this before. Get the load distribution wrong, hit one unlucky swell at the wrong angle, and the entire stone disappears to the bottom of the sea, along with however many months of labor it had already cost to get it that far. The fact that it arrived at all tells you these were not desperate amateurs improvising. They were almost certainly drawing on generations of accumulated practical knowledge about boats, ropes, leverage, and large-scale group coordination that simply never survived in any written form, because writing itself didn't exist yet in Britain at the time. Modern experimental archaeologists who've tried to recreate small-scale versions of this kind of stone hauling, using only materials and techniques available 5,000 years ago, generally need dozens of people working in careful, exhausting coordination, just to move a fraction of this weight, a fraction of this distance. Scale that up to 700 kilometers, and you are no longer looking at a single afternoon's labor. You are looking at a sustained, multi-year, possibly multi-generational project, involving an enormous number of people who had to be fed, organized, motivated, and kept working toward a goal that offered no immediate survival benefit whatsoever. Someone had to plan the route. Someone had to negotiate a safe passage through territories belonging to communities who had no obligation to help, and every reason to be suspicious of strangers dragging a giant rock through their land. Someone had to keep dozens or hundreds of laborers fed and willing to keep pulling, week after week, mile after grinding mile, on a project whose payoff existed only in belief, not in anything they could eat, wear, or defend themselves with. Which raises the question that, frankly, matters far more than the mechanics of ropes and rollers. Why would anyone do this? Why would a Neolithic community in the far north of Scotland agree to give up or help transport a sacred-seeming 6-ton stone, sending it on a journey of hundreds of kilometers to be erected at the center of a monument built by people they may never have even met? The leading theory emerging from this research isn't really about engineering at all. It's about politics, in the oldest and most human sense of that word. Many archaeologists now suspect that Stonehenge wasn't simply a local monument built by one nearby community for their own private religious purposes. It may have functioned as something closer to a unifying project, a deliberate act of bringing together stones, and by extension, people, ideas, and allegiances from genuinely distant and culturally distinct parts of ancient Britain into a single shared sacred site. Think about how unusual that would have been for its time. Most of what we know about Neolithic Britain suggests a patchwork of relatively small, scattered farming communities, each tied closely to their own immediate territory, their own local burial customs, their own regional pottery styles, distinct enough that archaeologists can often tell which part of the island a given piece of broken crockery came from just by its decoration. These were not nations. There was no single ruler, no shared currency, no obvious mechanism binding a farming settlement in the far north of Scotland to a community on Salisbury Plain hundreds of kilometers south. And yet, somehow, a stone from one of the most remote, far-flung corners of the island ended up embedded at the symbolic center of a monument built by people who, by every reasonable assumption, spoke a different dialect, followed somewhat different customs, and had likely never set foot in each other's territory before this project began. If that's true, then every stone hauled in from somewhere else wasn't just construction material. It was a kind of physical signature, a community's literal contribution, written into the monument permanently, the ancient equivalent of carving your name into something you helped build, together with strangers from across an entire island, at a moment in history when most communities had little reason to think of themselves as connected to anyone living hundreds of kilometers away. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting Stonehenge may have functioned less like a single tribe's temple and more like an early physical version of a shared national monument, a place built specifically to represent unity between communities that otherwise had Little in common, using the one universal language available to all of them, the unmovable, indifferent mathematics of where the sun rises and sets on the two most extreme days of the year. A stone from Scotland standing at the heart of a monument in southern England isn't just a transport puzzle solved. It might be the oldest known physical evidence that the people living on this island, 5,000 years before anyone called it Britain, already understood the value of being seen as one people rather than many. And this is where a separate, unrelated discovery, announced only weeks ago, fits into the story in a way that almost feels too perfectly timed to be coincidence. A team from Wessex Archaeology revealed they had found a structure near Stonehenge that may have served as an early prototype for the monument itself, not built from stone at all, but from wood. Two timber posts set nearly 400 feet apart, deliberately aligned, so that one marked the rising sun on the summer solstice, and the other marked the setting sun on the winter solstice. Carbon dating places this wooden structure roughly 500 years before Stonehenge's stone phase began. In other words, before anyone organized the staggering multi-year effort of hauling stones from Wales and Scotland, somebody on that exact same patch of land had already worked out, with wooden poles and patient observation of the sky, precisely where the sun would rise and set on the two most extreme days of the year, and had already decided that this particular spot on Salisbury Plain was worth marking permanently for that reason. Sit with that timeline for a moment, because it reframes the entire monument as something far less sudden and far more deliberate than the popular image of Stonehenge usually suggests. This wasn't one inspired generation waking up one spring and deciding to build something spectacular on a whim. This was a location that mattered to people for half a millennium before the first bluestone ever arrived. 500 years of watching the same horizon, tracking the same sunrise, passing down the same accumulated knowledge of exactly where the light would fall on the two shortest and longest days of the year, long enough that the original wooden posts themselves had probably rotted away and been replaced more than once before anyone attempted to translate that knowledge into permanent stone. Whoever eventually decided to go fetch a stone from Scotland wasn't starting a new tradition. They were finishing one that their ancestors, hundreds of years dead by that point, had already begun. Put those two discoveries together, and a genuinely striking picture starts to emerge, one far more compelling than anything an AI headline generator dreamed up. 500 years before the first bluestone ever arrived from Wales, this location was already considered sacred, already understood deeply enough that someone could chart its solstice alignments using nothing but timber and careful observation, accurate enough to for a doubts. At the later stone monument, built across multiple separate construction phases over centuries, would preserve and refine those exact same alignments in solid rock. Then, at some point, the ambition attached to this place outgrew local wood and local effort entirely. Someone, or some growing alliance of someones, decided this sacred alignment deserved permanence, deserved material pulled not just from the nearest convenient hillside, but from the genuine far reaches of the land, Wales for the bluestones, and astonishingly, Scotland for the single most important stone at its very heart. 5,000 years before satellite phones, before paved roads, before the wheel was even in widespread use in Britain, somebody coordinated a construction project spanning the better part of the length of the island, built around the unmovable, indifferent mathematics of where the sun happens to rise and set twice a year. There's something worth sitting with in just how long this took to figure out, too. People have been staring directly at Stonehenge for literally thousands of years. Roman writers mentioned it. Medieval chroniclers invented increasingly fantastical stories about wizards and giants to explain it because they had no better explanation available. Antiquarians dug around it for centuries, dragging away souvenir fragments, drawing wildly inaccurate diagrams, convinced at various points that it was a Druid temple, a Roman temple, even a kind of ancient astronomical computer built by some lost advanced civilization, because the alternative, that ordinary Neolithic farmers organized something this ambitious using nothing but rope, timber, and willpower, felt, for a very long time, almost too implausible to take seriously. Even within professional archaeology, the glacier theory survived as long as it did, partly because it offered a strange kind of comfort. It let us avoid fully reckoning with just how capable these supposedly primitive communities actually were. It is, in a quiet way, easier to imagine ice doing the impossible work than to imagine our own distant ancestors pulling it off with nothing but their hands and each other. It took modern mineral fingerprinting technology, the same basic forensic logic used to trace a bullet back to a single weapon, applied patiently over the course of just the last 2 years, to finally settle an argument that had quietly run for the better part of a century. And the answer that technology gave wasn't a hidden warning or a terrifying secret or proof of some lost advanced civilization. It was something arguably more remarkable than any of that. Proof that a community of Stone Age people, working with nothing more advanced than rope, timber rollers and raw determination, organized an effort spanning hundreds of kilometers and likely multiple generations, purely because they believed a specific patch of empty grassland and the exact angle at which the sun touched it twice a year was worth almost anything it cost them to mark permanently. So the next time you see a headline insisting some artificial intelligence just cracked open a terrifying secret buried in Stonehenge, you can let it go without a second thought. Because the actual secret, the one real scientists spent years methodically proving with rock dust and river sediment rather than chatbot output, is sitting right there in plain sight. And it's far more impressive than anything a content mill could invent. 5,000 years ago, with none of the tools we'd consider basic today, a scattered network of ancient communities across the length of Britain looked at one quiet stretch of plain, recognized something in it worth more than the easy convenience of using whatever stone happened to be lying nearby, and chose instead to reach as far as Scotland to bring something truly meaningful home. That's not a terrifying mystery. That's just what real human ambition, sustained patiently across generations, has always looked like, long before any of us were around to write headlines about it. And maybe that's the part actually worth remembering the next time you stand on that plane, or watch a video about it, or scroll past one more exaggerated claim trying to sell you a fake version of a story that was already extraordinary enough on its own.